Last week in chapter 8, we started out with that non-canonical uh, story about the woman caught in adultery. And we used it as the springboard into this tension between Jesus and the religious leaders in the temple. So we charted the kind of verbal back and forth and saw in the conclusion that Jesus was strictly making theological claims about who he was as God's own Son, his purpose to reveal God's light in the world, and the way that his expression, which is yet to be made, the way the truth and the light are really integrated into that concept of I am here as God's light in the world. So today we're going to look at the 9th chapter, and it's again a healing, and this time a healing of a man born blind. Blindness has always been a biblical image for failure to see God. So it has sort of this underlying, who's really blind here? Is it the man that's blind, or the religious leaders who can't see what's happening in this healing? And this chapter even intensifies the hostility that we have noted previous. John is also clear that there is opposition from Jesus from the get-go. And particularly the religious leaders have a great deal invested in him not succeeding in any way. So today we'll distinguish the healing of this blind man from the healings that are in Matthew there are 2 healings, in Mark 1, in Luke there are 2 healings of blind men. That's partially because blindness is pretty prevalent in a desert environment. It's just, you all know that our eyes are more fragile here, and they didn't have all the things that we had going for them. We'll discuss the interest of the Pharisees in what they term purity or cleanliness, and how important and why that was important to them. And then finally we'll conclude with Jesus' own response to the man that he has healed. So once again, we have an event, some dialogue, and then a statement of Jesus at the end. We've seen this pattern several times before. The event is important because it says this actually happened. This is an event that can be substantiated. Sometimes Jesus uses that substantiation in terms of a name, not Jesus, John, in terms of a name. Sometimes it's a location. This time it's this ongoing discussion or tug of war, really, in the temple courtyard between Jesus, the crowds, and the religious authorities. And then finally, Jesus will make that clarifying statement. So I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between sin and suffering before we hear anything. And it's very difficult for us to put all this together because we're scientific kind of people. For us, illness comes from germs, from malfunctions within our systems, within our body, and they can be, quote, treated. But illness was much more social in the first century Mediterranean world. The impact of illness was not as significant in how it limited the individual, but how it changed the individual's relationship to the whole community. Now, we say today, if a person has cancer, the whole family has it. because the whole family is engaged in learning about that and helping and assisting and making the treatment the best possible outcomes that can be. It's not that kind of involvement. It's rather that if you're not able to function in your community in the way that the community needs you to, then you now are a drag on that community. And rather than being always compassionate to that, it's easier to cut the losses and just exclude you. So it sounds harsh in our way, but to our way of thinking, but to the first century mind, illness shattered the community, and that was the difficulty. The community had to regroup without that person. So really there were 3 levels of, and then the relationship between sin and illness is that illness is often used as a descriptor of the sin that happens to be in place. So the cause of your illness is not a germ. The cause of your illness is indeed something that you've done, right? Because that's God intends you to live a good and a happy life. And if it's not that way, then you've done something. Now, there are 3 levels of sin. These are not started out, but we kind of sort the community's response into 3 levels. And they are all traced back to some kind of disruption in the social network. The lowest level is the accidental insult, or the failure to greet someone with proper respect. Somebody gave you a gift and you failed to give a gift of the like value in return. So these are very small infractions, and those are sins that can be overcome. You make restitution. You're contrite before the person that you insulted accidentally or just unknowingly. So the sin results in a short period of social suffering and being scorned, but there's a way out of it. I pay back the money I owed you that I forgot I owed you, and it was an insignificant amount. And the relationship is restored. The sin is no more. You're welcome back into the community. So now there's a mid-level of social disruption of social relationships, and these are more serious. It's sort of like you steal something. It wasn't something that was essential to the livelihood of another person, but you just went ahead and stole it. This is an interesting case. Carmen allows her daughter to be married to George's son, but George refuses to let his son marry into Carmen, to let his daughter marry into Carmen's family. So these kind of, we're supposed to be joined, and so it makes sense that brothers and sisters would continue to marry, but no. And so that's a higher level insult. It's you saying, I'm just a little better than the family that we got that kind of not so good son from. So they need an outside mediator to rectify these kinds of circumstances. And ordinarily, that would be the eldest person in the town, who would be considered the most revered and the person to make that decision. Or it could be the 2 elders of the family getting together to resolve that. It would almost always include a monetary repayment. But once again, you could be restored into community. The highest level of social relationships are the most serious crimes. And basically, it's the second half of the Ten Commandments. All the don't thieve, don't lie, don't covet, don't commit adultery. Oh, by the way, adultery in a betrothed couple, that's a mid-level. You can just buy that one off. You don't really have to stone that woman. Yeah, so that, remember, that was kind of a question last time. But this dishonor is extreme and it is total. And if murder, adultery, false witnessing, theft of something serious, I stole your cow, this is serious. This is really important. These are not revocable sins. Rather, vengeance is required. You have to get the same amount back. Now, this is where the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, no, that's not it. Eye for an eye and limb for a limb, whatever, is a limit. You may not take your vengeance beyond how you have been harmed. So it's a limit on your vengeance, but it's really only a modest control. I mean, once you've introduced vengeance into a community, you're probably not going to be able to control that, and the person who has committed that sin likely, if they want to survive, will flee to a sanctuary city. And there they'll have to make a life among other people who have had to flee. And this is the sad part, is that ordinarily there's no reconciliation. Vengeance is extracted, but community relationships are not healed. And if community relationships are healed, it's a sign of God's grace. Only God can heal those. So all of the sins and all of the questions about illness result in some form of exclusion from the community. If you were born deformed, your arms put on your body in an odd way, or if you're blind or deaf, you're excluded from birth. Okay, from birth. That doesn't mean your family doesn't care for you. It just means when we count who's in the community, you're never counted. You're not a part of it. Let's hold it. And again, forgiveness for the first two levels, it can be affected through community relationships, but forgiveness always necessitates some form of active reconciliation, and it's usually monetary. It's usually, I pay for my sins. Sin of the highest level is forgivable only by God, and it also, of course, requires some retribution, contrition, etc. So the Pharisees are very strict about how they deal with ill people, because any illness is an indication that there's an underlying sin, and they don't want to be in relationship to anyone who's sinning, because a sinner is unclean, and uncleanliness is contagious. So if I'm being excluded because I forgot to say good morning to Dora when she came in and I just ignored her, then the community ignores me for a while, and a Pharisee would want nothing to do with me, whereas my family might continue to eat with me. So they're very conscious of all of these boundary lines. And when you're conscious of such boundary lines, then you're often overly conscious, right? The slightest thing, and you exclude that person from your relationships. So that's one of the important things to know that's underlying this whole healing scene. So that's enough for me. I'm going to read and then chapter 9. As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." And when he said this, he spat on the ground, made mud with saliva, spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. And then he went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Now some were saying, "It is he." And others were saying, "No, but it's someone like him." And he kept saying, "I am the man." And they kept asking him, "How then were your eyes opened?" And he answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' And then I went and I washed, and I received my light." And they said to him, "Where is he?" And he said, "I do not know." Couple things about this chapter. That vague notion as it opens, as he was walking along. Remember, this is, in theory, the day after the final day of the Feast of Tabernacles. So Jesus has continued in the temple courtyard, or at least they have linked these two so that the importance of the light that had been experienced in the Feast of the Tabernacles is reflected in this story. So the chapter considers the capacity of sight and vision as being not just ordinary vision, but really insight into how God is in the world. Notice that this blind person does not make any request for a healing. In fact, he's treated as an object lesson. Who sinned? Did he sin, or was it his parents? So that kind of reveals the thinking, the thought process of the people. And we could say it another way, but we could say it, why is he being excluded from the community? Was it his fault, or was it his parents' fault? Because that's what it's about. It's about being excluded. Notice he's the one who begs, right? He can't work. He has to live on alms. So his disciples have made that assumption, and then Jesus flips this question of sin. And he starts, and it's so subtle but so beautiful. He says, "We must be doing the works of him who sent me," and that the man was in sin so that God's work would be revealed. And in the Gospel of John, work is always belief. So it's not talking about healing vision per se, it's talking about healing the capacity to believe in God and to believe in Jesus. So it's beautifully woven together, but hard to pick out, and so contrary to the way that we think. Not talking about morality sin, talking about the sin of not seeing and perceiving God in the world. Jesus does what any healer who was dealing with a blind person would do, which is make mud out of spittle. Oh, and there's a little word that word that's translated to make mud is to knead. It's like kneading bread. And kneading on the Sabbath is specifically called work and not to be done. So there's another little jam right in there, just very small and hidden. The man just gets up. He doesn't even say, "Thank you, Jesus, I'll go do what you say." He just gets up, goes and does it, comes back seeing, and this provokes, has this really happened? Who is this and how is this? So let's take a little break. So we're going to start at 13. We're going to go all the way through 23. Starting at 23. They brought to the Pharisee the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day. The plot thickens. It's not said there. When Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. When the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight, he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see." And some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he doesn't observe the Sabbath." But the others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes that he opened." And the blind man said, "He is a prophet." The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he see?" And his parents answered, "We know that this is our son, and we know that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this is important, his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, meaning the religious leaders, for the Jews, the leaders, had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." So this is, the neighbors can't believe that this has happened. The man tells his story. The Pharisees come and they will start to listen to his story. He made mud. Immediately, he's broken the Sabbath law and thus a sinner. And God does not listen to the voice of sinners, they assume. So it's interesting as it goes along. Sometimes the man is called the man who had received his sight, and sometimes he's still called the blind man, right? So the stigma of his blindness has yet to be removed, and that's what's really at issue. Will he be allowed into the community? Now there's a deeper wrinkle because the Jews, the leaders, have said that anybody who wants to follow that Jesus character is out of the synagogue. Well, this is huge. Literally, you cannot live in your society if you're excommunicated. You all now are going to be outcasts if that happens. So that's why they refuse to go any further than say, "Ask my son, because he's of age." Or what age is of age? Ordinarily, it would have been 12 years or 13 years when you made your bar mitzvah. Then you were a true son of Abraham. But this guy never did that. He never had that opportunity to be bar mitzvahed. So it must have been a mature adult, because you couldn't go by the standard of the community since he was outside the community. I pondered that very question as well. Chapter 9, beginning at verse 24. For the second time they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God," which is something similar to us saying, "I swear to tell the whole truth no matter what."
My translation says the truth.
Yeah, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. And he answered him, I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. And they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? And then they reviled him, saying, you are his disciples, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, remember this continual complaint about Jesus, we do not know where he comes from. And the man answered, here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they answered, you who were born entirely in sin are trying to teach us? And they drove him out. Okay, that's 34. Let me just make a couple comments. Well, it's just full of all of these underpinnings, but, tell the truth, and we already know he's a sinner. Tell the truth, but make sure it falls within our judgment. All right. So he says, well, frankly, I don't know whether he's a sinner or not. But according to his deed, I would have to say he's been sent by God. Now, Toby, do you hear how this is moving from this to belief? And then he says, oh, maybe you want to become his disciples. So that's a real moment where it's not about the healing. It's about, this is a man from God. We ought to be paying attention to him. I think that's all I need to tell you. Oh, and then I think it's important to hear that they moved to their theologically safe corner, which is, we don't know where he came from, you were born in sin, and neither of you can teach us, because we know Moses, and we know the law. And then that last phrase, where they drove him out, that means they excommunicated him on the spot. You are no longer, he wasn't in the first place, but now he's a seeing man. He's not able to be part of the community.
Doesn't 38 kind of define the whole thing? Where he says,
Oh,
yes,
we have to
I
get
believe.
there. We have to get there, Toby. No fair reading ahead. Okay, anything else that we want to say about this little exchange right here? Okay, then we'll move in, we'll get to the good stuff, which is the conclusion, and it goes from 35 until the end. Okay, no more questions, right? All right. 9:35 through the conclusion of the chapter. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he answered, and who is he, sir, or Lord? Tell me that I may believe in him. And Jesus said, you have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. Jesus said, I came into the world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind. Now some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, surely we are not blind, are we? And Jesus said to them, If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, we see, your sin remains. Okay, a few notes about it. It's very poignant to me that Jesus heard that he had been driven out, and then he found him. He looks for the man and intentionally, essentially welcomes him in. He's been driven out. He's no longer a part of his previous community. And Jesus is saying, you are a part of my community now. The man does not know what the phrase Son of Man means. It ordinarily means from Daniel, the figure who will precede the Messiah, the one that will signal the beginning of God's reign. But he's had no religious education, right? Because he's all he knows about religion is what he's overheard. Nobody ever sat down and taught him. So the Son of Man at the beginning of God's realm are linked together, and Jesus says, now you've seen him with your spiritual eyes, not just with your sighted eyes, and the one who's speaking to you, I am he. In John, worship is always associated and offered to God. So when it says he worshiped Jesus, it's the indication that he saw God in and through Jesus. And then Jesus concludes with a large and difficult to unpack statement about judgment. But it's really the grand reversal statement that in the Synoptics is, the lowly will be lifted up and the mighty will be put down. It's that kind of changes. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. It's that same theme that if you claim to know everything, you remain estranged from God. But if you understand that you do not know everything, then you have the potential to be inspired and to believe. And that's what has happened, and that's what Jesus confirms. And the Pharisees get it, because they say, wait a minute, is he saying that we're blind? And Jesus essentially says, as long as you stick to your rigidity, you will not be able to see God's goodness when it's right before your eyes. And that's the conclusion that John 9 comes to. Jesus came so that those who were blind, who were wanting to see but could not, could see, and that those who were so sure would be blinded. And what happens when you're blinded? Then you have the option to see. So it's not judgment in terms of division, it's judgment in terms of a level playing field, that until we understand that we will not master all of life, and that God is important in whatever understandings we come to, if we can't allow that blindness to be opened in that fashion, then we really can't come to believe. Surely we are not blind, are we? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, we see, your sin remains. Okay, a few notes about it. It's very poignant to me that Jesus heard that he had been driven out, and then he found him. He looks for the man and intentionally, essentially welcomes him in. He's been driven out. He's no longer a part of his previous community. And Jesus is saying, you are a part of my community now. The man does not know what the phrase Son of Man means. It ordinarily means from Daniel, the figure who will precede the Messiah, the one that will signal the beginning of God's reign. But he's had no religious education, right? Because all he knows about religion is what he's overheard. Nobody ever sat down and taught him. So the Son of Man at the beginning of God's realm are linked together, and Jesus says, now you've seen him with your spiritual eyes, not just with your sighted eyes, and the one who's speaking to you, I am he. In John, worship is always associated and offered to God. So when it says he worshiped Jesus, it's the indication that he saw God in and through Jesus. And then Jesus concludes with a large and difficult to unpack statement about judgment. But it's really the grand reversal statement that in the synoptics is, the lowly will be lifted up and the mighty will be put down. It's that kind of changes. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. It's that same theme that if you claim to know everything, you remain estranged from God. But if you understand that you do not know everything, then you have the potential to be inspired and to believe. And that's what has happened, and that's what Jesus confirms. And the Pharisees get it, because they say, wait a minute, is he saying that we're blind? And Jesus essentially says, as long as you stick to your rigidity, you will not be able to see God's goodness when it's right before your eyes. And that's the conclusion that John 9 comes to. Jesus came so that those who were blind, who were wanting to see but could not, could see, and that those who were so sure would be blinded. And what happens when you're blinded? Then you have the option to see. So it's not judgment in terms of division, it's judgment in terms of a level playing field, that until we understand that we will not master all of life, and that God is important in whatever understandings we come to, if we can't allow that blindness to be opened in that fashion, then we really can't come to believe. Okay, that's it.